Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for being here this evening. My name is Alison Mountz. I am the Interim Vice Principal, Research and Innovation at U of T Scarborough, and I am a professor of geography. And I'm so delighted to be here to be moderating this panel. I'm excited because I love the opportunity to gather and to speak with leading creative thinkers who are tackling some of the most complex and important challenges and defining challenges of our time. I want to begin tonight by acknowledging the land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we're grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. We're really delighted to have you all here tonight for this important discussion. This is hosted by the Institute for Environment, Conservation, and Sustainability, which you will hear referred to as the IECS. The Institute is based at the University of Toronto, Scarborough, but of course their work spans all three campuses and is all about bringing people together. The IECS is committed to fostering interdisciplinary research on the environment. The Institute's goal is to bring together students, faculty, and the public to explore pressing environmental issues while helping build new research networks and collaborations. But of course, the work doesn't stop there. They also have a strong educational mission, one that focuses on creating learning opportunities not just for the U of T community, but also for the public at large. So we're glad to have this beautiful space to gather in. These opportunities allow us to hear from those directly engaged in the fight against climate change so that we can all better understand the complexities of these global challenges. I thought someone was advancing slides behind me while I was speaking, so now I'm gonna catch you up visually. This is the IECS, the institute I mentioned at U of T Scarborough. And the IECS has organized a series of talks this fall. The first already happened by the wonderful author John Vaillant, who spoke on communicating fire on his best-selling book. And tonight we're lucky to be here with our speakers who will be talking on corporations, on climate, greenwashing, or progress. And there will be additional events to come which I'm sure you will be excited to hear about, perhaps as we close, from Director Imre Zeman, who is sitting right here. So one great example of this mission of IECS is this series which brings together journalists, scholars, activists to discuss the ongoing challenges that we face in communicating the urgency of climate change. It's a conversation that we believe is crucial to help drive action. This series would not be possible. We wouldn't be able to bring these wonderful speakers together without the support of sponsors that include Cited Media, Harbinger, Another Story Bookshop, and Canada's National Observer. To just say a little bit more about tonight's topic, corporations have begun to take climate change seriously, with many racing to showcase their attention to sustainability and ESG credentials. Yet greenwashing scandals abound, from ineffective carbon offset schemes to misleading net zero claims, making it difficult to distinguish genuine efforts from deception. Critics argue that capitalism itself is incompatible with preventing catastrophic climate change, suggesting that any solution based on it is destined to fail. Meanwhile, supporters of ESG initiatives contend that we lack the time to fundamentally overhaul capitalism before addressing the most severe climate threats, making the system we must work within. And of course, we're living through these disasters as we speak all around the globe. This panel will explore this pressing question. Can green capitalism play a meaningful role in addressing the climate crisis, or is it merely a smokescreen designed to maintain the status quo? So I'm about to introduce our three speakers. Our format tonight is that each will present for a short time. They're going to talk about their work, And then we'll open up the floor for questions, and we have the group of you who are here in the room, as well as folks listening online who will have an opportunity to ask questions as well. So let me say thank you to our three panelists who are here tonight. I'll introduce them briefly now. Our first speaker is Mellissa Aronczyk. She's professor of media studies in the School of Communication and Information at Rutgers University. She's the co-author with Maria Espinosa of A Strategic Nature, Public Relations and the Politics of Environmentalism, winner of the 2023 Roderick Hart Outstanding Book Award in Political Communication, and the 2022 Outstanding Book Award in Public Relations, Innovation, Development, and Educational Achievement, or PRIDE. Both are from the National Communication Association. Her research on how PR affects our ability to communicate about climate change has been featured in The Nation, The Financial Times, Rolling Stone, CNBC, The Intercept, Grist, Adweek, and Yes Magazine. She's also written stories about PR and sustainability for The Washington Post and Foreign Policy. Ralph Torrie is Director of Research at Corporate Knights and a recognized leader in sustainable energy and environmental policy. With over 40 years of experience, Ralph has worked as an analyst, communicator, and advocate for sustainability, pioneering strategies to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. He co-founded Torrie Smith Associates, a consulting firm that develops software used by over 300 municipalities, companies, and organizations worldwide to strategically address climate impacts. Ralph has also served as a key consultant for international initiatives, including the Energy Research Group of the United Nations University and climate programs for local governments globally. And finally, John Woodside was named one of Canada Clean 50's emerging leaders in 2023 for his outstanding reporting on the climate and related issues, focusing on finance, lobbying, energy policy, and the climate emergency from Ottawa. Woodside brings a depth of experience to Canada's National Observer. Before joining Canada's National Observer, he reported on energy for all New Brunswick and all Newfoundland Labrador and focused on Muskrat Falls, nuclear power, and the Irving Group of companies. He's also worked with Cited Media and with the foreign policy news outlet Open Canada. Please join me in welcoming our three panelists. Okay, so Mellissa, if you would start us off, thank you. You're welcome to, wherever you feel most comfortable. There are mics in both places.
Hi, everyone. Thank you all for being here tonight. As Alison mentioned in her introduction, I'm a professor of media and communication. And so my research is angled toward how companies communicate with their stakeholders through the media and on different media platforms. That has led me to look at not the companies alone, but also at the people who communicate on their behalf. The public relations consultants, the ad agencies, the marketing teams, the strategic experts, and the lobbyists who shape the ideas and the messages that these companies want to promote around climate change. One thing I've learned from spending so much time looking at these promoters and go-betweens is that they play a much bigger role than people tend to think. When we criticize, say, Cenovus or Suncor for their misleading or unrealistic statements about net zero, we imagine the heads of those companies as the ones in charge of that message. But in reality, a lot of the time, there's an army of promotional experts who are designing and shaping the influence tactics used by any one company. And if those tactics look similar across companies or across sectors, that's because it's often the same experts working for multiple clients across similar issues. So for me, if you want to understand what corporations are doing about climate change, you have to look at the architects of the strategies and the messaging about climate change, which are these consultants and PR people and ad agencies and lobbyists. They are the ones who influence the investors, the political decision makers, and the public about risky issues like the climate crisis. And I really want to stress the importance of this group in changing the narrative about what counts as climate action. These strategists influence the norms, the expectations, and the social understandings of what's considered acceptable behavior toward the environment. More than this, they influence what counts as the right expertise to control what climate action means. Let me give you one relatively dramatic example of how this has played out. For the last 30 plus years, since 1992, the United Nations Global Climate Summits have allowed so-called non-state actors to participate. This category includes all kinds of non-governmental organizations, including the business community. And one outcome of having the business community participate in international climate conferences was to change the narrative about what needs to be done to deal with the climate crisis. The narrative goes something like this. We need to think about the cost of climate action. Yeah, the science, sure, the science, but also the money. We need cost-benefit analyses to determine if environmental regulations are worth the restrictions they place on business. We need partnerships between business groups and environmental groups to come up with environmental rules or goals that are friendly to business. We need corporate-led certification and disclosure schemes so that we can track our own progress on the metrics we think are most important. That has become the dominant narrative today. Many of these initiatives come straight out of the playbook of green public relations and advertising and marketing. And the goal was to make those green business strategies seem normal, to change the story about what we considered okay for companies to do, and to allow business to run the show by becoming the ultimate decision makers about what the best pathways were to demonstrate climate action. Paradoxically, that narrative, that approach, would become much more devastating to the scientific consensus on climate change than the outright denial. Because even as it became less and less socially acceptable to deny the science, these green business strategies were a much more subtle kind of denial in the form of delay, distraction, and deviation from the urgent need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And what we ended up with was what one public relations consultant I interviewed called sustainable communication. Sustainable communication is environmental risk management that uses the approaches I've just mentioned: voluntary, corporate-led environmental compliance, industry benchmarking, and strategic alliances between companies and environmental groups. And it is deeply invested in maintaining the relationship between environmental protection and economic profit. Sustainable communication is really about the political and economic sustainability of companies. It's about sustaining business as usual. You guys are sorry I went first now, aren't you? In 2021, at the United Nations Climate Summit, just to bring us up to the present, this climate summit in 21 was known as COP26, Conference of the Parties 26. One of the largest delegations at this conference was from the fossil fuel industry, with over 100 companies and 30 trade associations represented. The 2022 Climate Summit, COP27, listed 636 registered lobbyists for oil and gas companies. And at last year's COP28 Summit in Dubai, the president of the United Nations Conference is the CEO of the Abu Dhabi National Oil Company. Let me bring that story now from the intergovernmental level down to the Canadian level with a word about some research I recently published with two colleagues about Pathways Alliance. Pathways Alliance, some of you may know, is a lobby group made up of Canada's 6 largest oil sands producers, who together constitute about 95% of the country's oil sands production. So those companies are Canadian Natural Resources, Cenovus Energy, Imperial Oil, Meg Energy, Suncor Energy, and ConocoPhillips. Pathways Alliance's big claim for the industry is that they will reach net zero by 2050. My colleagues and I wanted to look into this net zero claim. So working with Chris Russell of Carleton University and Patrick McCurdy at the University of Ottawa, we analyzed hundreds of documents that were produced by or about Pathways Alliance between 2021 and 2023 to show the extent of Pathways greenwashing around their net zero claims. All of the techniques I mentioned earlier, partnerships, fuzzy numbers, behind-the-scenes lobbying, were at play in the case of Pathways. Now, in June of this year, 2024, the Canadian government issued Bill C-59, which created amendments to the Competition Act and introduced new language to strengthen the rules and penalties around false or misleading environmental claims, otherwise known as greenwashing. The night before the bill passed, Pathways scrubbed its website. It took out everything related to their claim to reach net zero by 2050. Why? We could look for the answer in an op-ed published by the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers, or CAP, in the Financial Post. As you might imagine, CAP, on behalf of its many members, was very upset about Bill C-59, and they wrote in this op-ed that, quote, businesses across Canada are being put at significant risk for communicating their efforts to reduce their impact on the environment. I couldn't have said it better myself. The industry wants to control the conversation about climate action without taking on the responsibility or accountability of genuine climate action. Personally, I think Bill C-59 is a step in the right direction. I think it makes companies accountable for what they say, and it pushes them to align what they say with what they do. Because without clear rules and requirements, these companies will continue to delay and distract us from the urgent need to deal with climate change in a meaningful way. I'll leave it there and look forward to what my colleagues have to say.
Thanks so much, Mellissa. I've already read bios, so I'll just invite Ralph Torrie up to speak as our next panelist. Thanks so much, Ralph.
First of all, I should apologize to any of you that came here tonight hoping to hear Toby Heaps speak for Corporate Nights. I'm sure you're disappointed. I know that I would be if I came here to hear Toby and Ralph Torrie showed up instead. Toby's in London tonight and asked me if I could represent the organization, which is a tricky thing to do because Corporate Nights is a hydra-headed beast. And the branch that might be most relevant and mostly directly related to what Mellissa has just been talking about are the efforts that Toby's been spearheading with industry associations in Europe and in the United States. Well, not actually with the associations, but with industry leaders who are part of the network that Corporate Nights has developed over the years, who find themselves at odds with their industry associations with regard to the way that their industry is being represented in the political discussions, particularly around climate change. So it's a very interesting project about which I know not very much, but it's an example of some of the behind-the-scenes work that Corporate Nights is doing to try and bring a more progressive view to the way that some of the industries that we work with are being represented in the capitals of the world by their industry associations, which tend to be, for whatever reason, somewhat to the right of the general membership. Corporate Nights also, there's so little time, I'm just going to sort of look through a couple of peepholes at some of the work that we're doing in the hopes that it will stimulate ideas and questions for discussion later. I came to Corporate Nights only 3 years ago, when most people my age would have been retiring. The pandemic had blown through, and Toby had asked me to do some work on what a green economic recovery might look like for Canada. And from there, eventually it led to a more permanent relationship, or at least a more steady relationship. And I've been the director of research there for the last 3 years, where there's 2 projects that I want to briefly mention that touch on what we're talking about tonight. One, and it's really what I was brought in to do, was, first of all, we don't believe anything that companies tell us. Partly because we are interested in quantitative measurement of performance. Secondly, the traditional ESG metrics are not that interesting. We do them. We have like 21 or 22 of these indicators. That's a fairly commodified activity. But what we've been doing for the last 3 years is, first of all, I developed a taxonomy of definitions of what constitutes sustainable production, in my opinion, with some help. And then we take this taxonomy and systematically look at the revenue and the capital expenditures of basically the 2,500 largest companies, publicly traded companies in the world. So it's very labor intensive. There's a staff of 12 people that just grind away at this. And when they get finished, they have to start over because we do it every year. And what we're looking for is the extent to which companies are making their money by producing the things that the world needs to get through this sustainability transition. And we're looking for the extent to which their capital expenditures are also aligned with the things that the world needs to get through this transition. And the numbers are pretty low, but they're growing quickly. And in the course of doing that work, and in direct response to part of the question that was put to us as panelists tonight, it's undeniable, I would argue, that there are large privately held, in other words, capitalist organizations that are making material contributions to the transition to sustainability. They don't include the oil companies, obviously, with 1 or 2 very extraordinary exceptions that one finds of oil companies that are transitioning out of oil, which is about the only way an oil company is going to be sustainable, is to get out of the oil business. But throughout the spectrum of the rest of the economy, from the automobile industry to the electric power industry to the buildings industry, there are very fast-growing, interesting, and powerful examples of capitalist organizations making money and growing very quickly the business of producing the sustainable buildings and power plants, whether they be solar or wind, and vehicles that we need to get through this transition. So, we've identified $3 trillion so far of revenue of this sort, and we're still going. So it's not insignificant. I'm not sure that it answers the question whether we are going to successfully respond to climate change. But if you look at all of the efforts that are going on in the world that are having an impact, I don't think you can deny that some of them are actually being led by capitalist organizations, whether you like it or not. Part of what we do in this work is, as I said earlier, we try to define, and this brings me to the greenwashing part of our agenda, we try to define what sustainability means throughout the economy, and not just on the climate file, although that obviously is the central focus of, rightly so these days. And there's only 12 of us, and so to do that, there's a lot of economic activity where we decided, let's see what the certification world has to offer. And so we developed a set of conditions, criteria, if you like, that we apply to eco-certifications. And we're looking for certifications that are that have a publicly closed disclosed methodology, that require third-party verification, that require continuing renewal, that have a governance structure which reaches outside of the industries and to avoid conflicts of interest, which is both process and outcome oriented, and which has a methodology that is stringent and aligned with the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. And we've looked at 678 certifications so far. We're doing this all the time. At any given time, there's 30 or 40 that are under review. And of the 678 we looked at, about 1 in 3 make it through those filters. You could argue that the rest are greenwash. We don't really know because so many of them get thrown out right away because they're not independent. There's not a third party. The methodology is not published. We never get to the question of whether the certification criteria itself aligns with the UN because we've already disqualified the certification on other grounds. Once we've disqualified them on everything but the alignment with the UN Sustainable Development Goals, we still end up throwing out about another 1 in 3 of what's left. So we end up with about a third of the original 678, and I think it's close to 700 now, that we then give some or partial credit to. It's just interesting. I thought it might be interesting to a group that is interested in the subject of greenwashing just to hear those numbers. So a relatively small percentage of the eco-certifications that are out there are, at least in our view, pass these filters and align with the UN goals. The ones that we do get through all of that process are tremendously helpful to us in identifying where the sustainable production is taking place. They're all on our website. We have a commitment to radical transparency at Corporate Knights, and you can go and you can see the list. You can see the ones we accepted and the ones we rejected and why we rejected them. So that's how fast 10 minutes goes by. I did want to just mention this sustainable economy intelligence database that we developed that allows us then to quantitatively assess the contribution that companies are making to the sustainability transition. And I also wanted to mention, in the context of greenwashing, we do come up face to face with that issue in our evaluation of certifications. And then finally, I'll take one more minute to tell you just a little bit about a project that we're doing that's called Climate Dollars, and we are systematically, and this builds on that work I mentioned earlier that I started during the pandemic, we are systematically evaluating the capital expenditures that it would take to transition Canada to a zero-emission economy and comparing them with the existing levels of capital investment, sector by sector, and then working with small groups of influencers and opinion leaders in these sectors to identify breakthrough strategies for closing these, what turn out to be very large gaps. And that work, we're right in the heat of it. It's at the end of the first year of a 3-year project. But I've seen enough in the numbers now to conclude that many, if not most of the things that we need to do to get through this transition, they will pay back, but not at rates of return that private investors are going to be particularly excited about. So that leads you to the conclusion that yes, there's a way out of this, but not without the public investor. What that means to the central question here about the relevancy of capitalism to addressing the climate change issue, I'm not sure. When I got asked to do this, I went looking to see if there were any capitalist countries in the world, and Singapore seems to be up there on the list. But most of the economies now are mixed, and I think that that's the system that we're going to have to work with over these next critical couple of decades in addressing climate change, where somehow we're going to have to find a way to combine the financial power of the public investor and its ability to take the long-term view and take the longer-term risks, the way we did when we built our electric power system and our highway system, to combine that with the know-how, if you like, that it resides in at least partly in that private sector, with how to actually spend these large amounts of money in a way to get the job done. So, some food for thought. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Ralph. And last but certainly not least, I'm pleased to welcome to the podium John Woodside from the National Observer.
Thank you. So, when I talk about my work, I tend to describe the journalism I do as focused on the money and the politics fueling climate change. So you can imagine that a conversation about the role of capitalism in our climate crisis right now and what role it's going to play in the energy transition can take you in a lot of different directions here. I think maybe a good place to start, though, is that it really depends what we mean by capitalism, right? So on the one hand, if we are looking at it as an economic system that is endless growth on a limited planet, that seems kind of clearly not ideally suited to the problem that we have when it comes to sustainability. If we're talking about an economic system that concentrates power in the hands of a few elites at the expense of others, I think this is also something that introduces some important questions, right? Because the climate crisis isn't just about cutting emissions, it's about what kind of world are we trying to build. Now that said, I don't think it's a great system for the problem that we have in front of us, but the climate science is telling us that we need to cut global emissions in half by the end of this decade. That's 5 years away, and then get to zero emissions basically as fast as we can after that. So I think that there's a very practical question here, right? I mean, do we see ourselves having a global revolution off capitalism in the next 5 years? How would we imagine that goes? And how convinced are we really that what comes next is going to be better suited? There's no guarantee that whatever comes next is an improvement. So I think this leaves us in a really difficult situation where we recognize we have an economic system that isn't very helpful for our goals, but we also have a time crunch. That means we can't really get away from this. I think the important thing to recognize here is that capitalism is not a static thing. Capitalism changes over time. I think when we look at some sectors like big tech right now, we can even observe how capitalism is changing in that space. So all of this to say, I think for people who care about climate change, want to see us get to maybe a fairer, more just world, a world where CAP and the Pathways Alliance and the fossil fuel industry isn't holding us back. I think the name of the game is going to be about how do we shift the balance in the economy towards cleaner alternatives and away from the harm. Now, I've got a couple ideas there, and maybe we can get into it more in the questions, but it's a daunting problem. Just last week, research out of this very university identified $1.4 trillion that went to coal, oil, and gas companies from just 18 companies on Bay Street in 1 year alone, 2022. Like, $1 trillion is kind of hard to wrap your head around, but like $1 trillion going into the problem. Like, this is a massive, massive issue that we have. So the goal, I would argue, is going to be about how do you erode the power of these incumbent industries while building up something new. There's regulatory things we can talk about, but to me, one of the most interesting examples of the ways people can flip the logic of capitalism on its head, try to use it to get to something better and more fair. I think there's a lot of indigenous sovereignty in this country that is pushing in this direction. Good examples, the Woodside Nation in present BC. And they're resisting, for those who don't know, they're resisting the Coastal GasLink pipeline. This is a major pipeline to transport fracked gas on one side of the province to an LNG export terminal on the other. This project was originally supposed to cost about $6.6 billion, but because the nation and allied land defenders went out there, slowed the construction, they were able to push it up to close to $15 billion. Kind of adding almost $10 billion to the cost. At the same time, you go to investors, the banks, for example, and you're basically arguing you're not going to see your return on this investment. That is the type of flipping the capitalist logic on its head that I think provides some effective tools in the present day. The goal is not just building a climate-safe future, it's preventing, catastrophic warming. So using the tools that are available, I think is really just vital. I mean, I don't know how else to put it. It's going to be vital to do that kind of stuff. I think there's some other things we can talk about maybe in the Q&A around some financial regulation we could see. Right now, most of the stuff we're seeing from our federal government is nibbling around the edges, a taxonomy that's not a taxonomy. I don't know if anyone saw that news the other week. We're talking about mandatory disclosure. So you disclose your climate risk, but you don't have to do anything about it yet. All this kind of stuff that's just sort of nibbling around the edges. And I think there's some really effective tools that we could actually start putting in place to require fossil fuel companies, financial institutions align with the country's climate goals. But it's going to be a fight. Maybe that's a good spot to, because I'm really excited for the questions actually. So I'm just going to leave it there. But it's the fight of our lifetime. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Thank all of you. That was great. Those were some great reflections and also provocations to get our conversation going, as you noted, John. And I'm going to take the first question to let you all warm up your thoughts before you jump up to ask questions. And a note to those online: we'll be keeping an eye on questions coming in from there as well. All of you spoke in different ways about action. And the work that you're doing. So, Mellissa, you talked a lot about who's involved in the strategy and who might have the power to change the narrative. Ralph, you spoke a lot about the research that you're doing, which really spoke to the research geek in me. I have this really great image of you and 12 staff members tackling enormous questions about how you'd go about measuring sustainability and calling corporations to task around the claims that they make. And John, you really used language like shifting the balance, flipping the logic of capitalism. You talked about indigenous sovereignty and allied land defenders as a great example of a contemporary struggle happening here in Canada. I'm sure there are lots of folks around the room who want to hear more about action. So I'm just wondering if you can kind of run with that theme and talk a little bit more about what actions you think can be amplified that are happening now, like the example that you gave, or others that you think need to be happening, given, as you note, that time is of the essence.
Okay. Is this?
Try again.
Maybe now? Maybe not?
I'm going to give you this one while they figure out that one.
Thanks. Okay. So, yeah, action, name of the game, right? So I think the Woodside Nation, which I talked about there, is really at the forefront of at least that fossil fuel project. But we see it all over the country, quite frankly. Another example I like is the Haida Nation. So for those who don't know, the Haida are Haida Gwaii is their traditional territory. It's an archipelago on the coast of British Columbia. And the Haida Nation is very against fossil fuels. They've long been against it. And for them, a big reason why is because they depend on the natural world, the ocean, for sustenance. When I was out there a couple of years ago for a reporting trip, and the phrase was, when the tide is out, the table is set. The tide goes out and there's abundant food everywhere, right? And they worry about what an LNG boom on the west coast of Canada would mean for the health of the ocean. It threatens it. And they've been kept out of the sort of the environmental assessment process of a lot of this because it isn't technically their land that the export terminal is being built on. So, from a settler government perspective, it comes across like, well, it's not your territory, so we don't need to engage you. But the effects of it do impact them. Now, you hold that in your head for a second. The other thing going on with the Haida Nation is they're on the cusp of a title agreement. They've been negotiating with British Columbia and with Canada for title, legal recognized title, something they never surrendered, right? I mean, it's not ceded away, but to have the settler governments recognize Haida Gwaii belongs to you. You have jurisdiction effectively over it. Over the water, over the land, jurisdiction. These two things could come together in an important way in the next few years. If we are serious about sovereignty, if we are serious about returning, not returning, sorry, I was gonna say returning sovereignty, but it's really like building something new. It's something that we've like denied nations for so long, right? So if we're trying to build into something new, that could be a very effective tool to preventing the fossil fuel build out. I think it's important to recognize that this is maybe a little tangential to the question about capitalism, but fossil fuels are a colonial type of project. It is a resource that is centralized somewhere that you have to spend resource, use power to assert control over. It is, unlike something like the sun, diffuse everywhere, can't monopolize it. Anyway, to wrap up that point, if we're moving into an era genuinely of reconciliation, if we're serious about returning sovereignty and recognizing sovereignty, that could be a recipe that starts moving us in a better direction. I'll share the platform back, but there's other actions around financial regulation we can maybe get into too later.
Thank you. Ralph or Mellissa, would you like to jump in?
Yeah, I think, it's been said tonight, but it needs to be repeated that we are really out of time on this issue. This one storm in Florida this past month, $50 to $100 billion in damage. One storm, 2 days. That's the kind of level of investment that needs to be directed at building up the solutions. And instead, we're forced when these events happen, whether they be wildfires or floods or these wild storms, you have no choice but to spend what it takes to clean up and carry on. And it's eating away at our prosperity in the rich countries. And it's killing people by the tens of thousands in the poor areas of South Asia. So climate change is a horrific global catastrophe that is upon us now. So when one juxtaposes that fact, setting aside all of the psychological problems that realization triggers in so many people's heads, and the cognitive biases that kick in, trying to prevent oneself from believing that this horrible truth could be true. And by the way, a lot of climate denial comes from that kind of cognitive bias kicking in. Action is the key to resolving both that paralysis that can set in when you realize the magnitude of the problem, and it's something that also is the key to growing hope and optimism for finding a way through. This is something Greta is very articulate on. Hope is not something that exists to be harvested. Hope is something that you manufacture by taking action. In terms of the kind of action that we need, as has already been said here tonight, there's kind of two sides to this. We've got to stop the fossil fuel commitments. We should not be building any more buildings that have fossil fuel heating systems. That's just adding to the future problem we face, because sooner or later we're going to have to take those fossil systems out and convert them to heat pumps. So don't build them with fossil heat systems in the first place. It's like so obvious that the sooner that we stop committing, especially with long-lived assets like buildings, to fossil dependence, the easier and the more possible it may be that we find a way through this. It's true on a smaller scale with vehicles. The vehicles that are being purchased today in Canada will last into the 2030s. And we just saw our government turn down the opportunity of bringing affordable electric vehicles into Canada from China. In other words, climate change was trumped by that decision, pun intended. So we need to stop the fossil fuel growth, and then at the same time, we need to put our attention into building up these alternatives. I talked about some of the things that big companies are doing, and some of them are having a lot of success, and they're actually growing their revenues faster with these new technologies than they are with the old ones. But the most exciting and possibly in the long term, the most important work that's going on is at the community level, where you see communities taking back control of the capital investment in their communities through co-op structures. If the central financial superstructure is not going to do this job, then people need to take their retirement savings back under their own control in their communities and start making these transformations, these physical transformations in their buildings, in their transportation systems, and in their electric power systems. Those are the three big ones, community by community, and especially in cities. And so get involved in your community. Educate yourself. You're already doing that tonight, but then the next step is reach out to people who feel the way you do. Find a group that you can work with in taking action together, and the rest will, sort itself out from there.
Go ahead, Mellissa.
So this is on, right? Okay. I'm closely following two kinds of action that I find very inspiring. One is a number of social movements. I think many of them are based in the US, but there are of course, some worldwide that are working to, how would I put, they're working with employees of some of these companies. And as I mentioned, I'm focusing a lot on these strategic consultancies and public relations firms. These are movements that are working with employees at these firms, saying, you can go to your superiors and say, we don't want to continue working for a firm that has fossil fuel clients. We don't want to continue being part of that kind of investment. And it's been pretty impressive. There's one group called Clean Creatives in the United States that's doing this with considerable effect. Employees, if, we all know how hard it is to get and retain employees in companies and different organizations. If these employees are not happy, that creates a real motive for their leaders to do something about it. So these kinds of movements that work with employees can be very impactful. The other action that I'm finding really inspiring is the kind of litigation that's taking place, where legal teams are starting to hold not only fossil fuel companies, but also these consultancies accountable for their work in perpetuating the messaging that has distracted us and delayed action on climate change. And one of the things that's interesting about those approaches is that they look for patterns. So they look at other industries like the tobacco industry in the 1990s or the opioid industry now, and the kinds of litigation that took place to get ideas about how to pursue companies that are in the fossil fuel industry and try to remove their social license, as it's known, in addition to the actual legal consequences of what they're up to.
Is my mic? Yes, it is working. I'm going to check in for a moment with all of you in the room to see if there might be any questions percolating on the floor. And thank you. I see a couple of hands have gone up. So I'm just going to walk myself right back with this mic. Is that your job? Did I just take your job? Go ahead. Sorry. In the back. Thank you.
Is it on? Yeah. Oh, okay. I don't think I'm going to articulate this that well, but listening to everything you're talking about, I can relate it to the developed world. My concern is the third world countries, India and these places, huge populations, and poor people. I mean, how can they afford to go to an electric vehicle? Any thoughts on that?
Well, you've identified one of the central problems of this transition, which stems from the fact that it's very capital intensive. The things that we have to do to get off fossil fuels involve spending money now for long-term gain. So you have to have access to capital to make these changes. And if you leave it to the private sector, the poor will get left behind. Not even just the poor. A lot of us will get left behind. Who can afford a $100,000 retrofit on their house? never mind a $60,000 car, because you can't get an electric vehicle for much less. Well, there's some for 45 or 50. So what happens is the people who can afford to get off the old fossil fuel system will do it. And you think about the people you know who have done home retrofits and have the Teslas, they're pretty well off, and they're fine. And they've decoupled themselves now from dependence on the fossil fuel system. And the result is that the capital structure of the fossil fuel system now has to be shouldered by a shrinking group of clients, and guess who they are? The ones that could not afford those investments. Another reason, I think, why this has got to be a public enterprise. Dealing with this problem is the equivalent of the biggest collective actions that we have ever taken as countries and as a world. It's on a scale with a wartime effort. It's not actually, interestingly, as big as the COVID pandemic, where our government spent $250 billion 2 years in a row, which is like twice as much as the annual amount that we need to be putting into the transition. So I'm not actually worried about the size of what this is going to cost, but the distributional question that you've raised, it could kill the whole deal. This is why we have the yellow jackets in France. You will lose the political license to make this transition unless you do it in a way that brings everyone along. And that brings us back to the control of the transition has to be democratic and community-based.
John or Mellissa, would you like to go ahead, John?
Okay, yeah, that's a great question, and I have a couple of thoughts on it. So I'm very concerned about right now what we're seeing, which is millions into the global south, but billions out, to put it that way. We're still in a pretty colonial attitude about it, where rich Western countries, not exclusively, but we're here in Canada, so let's talk about it. There's a lot of investment flowing into the developing world, and what I'm concerned about is, I kind of referenced this in my initial comments, but it's what kind of world are we trying to build here? So I'll use India as an example. India, as we all know, this year became the most populated country. Most people in the world are in India now. And there are significant energy transition demands. Getting off of coal being a big one, but there's a lot. Now, interestingly, Canadian financial institutions, they see a lot of interest in India for a couple reasons. One, they see that there is the demand, the need to transition is there, but also you have the most people in the world becoming middle class, so more disposable income. They see it as a reliable investment, and Canadian financial institutions have been pouring money into India. The Canada Pension Plan, right, which many of us in this room, the Canada Pension Plan has a fiduciary duty to look out for our pensions. They've been throwing lots of money into India as part of energy transition needs. So why do I bring this up? Because when you start to introduce a profit motive into certain elements of the transition, then you're into a conversation about what kind of world are we trying to build. So for something like electric vehicles, sure, you could have a profit motive there. Someone can make it and pay CEOs, whatever. On something like climate adaptation, if we're just trying to weatherproof our cities, our infrastructure from natural disasters that we know are going to happen, we need to invest a lot of money in adapting ourselves. And there's not really a profit motive there. Or sometimes there can be, but there isn't always. Sometimes it's just money that has to be spent. So then you start thinking about things like, okay, well, what if you need a climate resilient highway? If it's going to be owned by pension firms, it's going to be a tolled highway. So Canadian pensions are going to be funded by people in India having a need to have like a climate resilient infrastructure. Like it just, I don't know if this like hits for anyone else, but to me this is like a real serious development question. Now, I'll try to wrap this point up quickly, but you know, on a real macro level, in the international COP negotiations that were referenced earlier, this year it's hosted in Azerbaijan, and specifically in Baku. And what's going to be one of the big conversations is what they call a new financing target. So history here, in 2009, rich countries promised the developing world, we will give $100 billion worth of climate finance by 2020. $100 billion for, you know, mitigation and adaptation, two general buckets. That promise was how we got the Paris Agreement. Like that was the promise that got countries to want to sign on, was there will be cash coming. We're a couple years late on that promise, but it's been met according to the latest estimates. And now the question is, what is our new target going to be? Everyone knows the need is going to be escalating into the trillions of dollars. So where are we going to get that money from? And the private sector obviously wants in on this. There's a lot of money to be made, and so these are kinds of the very real negotiations that are going on. It's very much like these types of development questions.
I'm not sure, John, if you were talking about the loss and damage fund, or that's another effort, but that's to respond to this really important question. At the most recent United Nations Climate Summit, Germany and the UAE pledged $100 million each to this loss and damage fund, and they're inviting other countries to contribute. And the idea is that it's a deal that will help the world's poorest and most vulnerable nations to offset, so to speak, the impacts of climate disaster. But the question there is, first, will companies use that as a smokescreen to then say, well, we've contributed, so good enough, you know, that we put some money into that fund. So that's, you know, we have to be very careful not to use that as an excuse, but just to say that's one of many kinds of initiatives that we're working on to continue to address the fact that this is really not a level playing field, globally speaking. And I mean, I guess I keep feeling like continuing to hold companies accountable, continuing to look at the fossil fuel industry specifically and the fact that they contribute to such a high percentage of global emissions, that these are the inflection points. These are the places where change really needs to happen in order to have the global impact and actually help people in countries where, as you say, they can't simply consume their way out of the problem.
Great. Thank you for getting us started. I saw a hand over here, and then I'll come over this way. So if you just look, yep, back in the corner. Thank you.
This is more of a focus on ESG, but when it comes to big companies sort of using carbon credits to drive their environmental initiatives, would you consider that greenwashing or progress?
I didn't catch the whole question, sorry.
Oh, carbon credits. Do you think that's greenwashing or progress?
I mean, I did some work on this about 30 years ago and got pretty turned off by it. I just haven't really, I can't get excited by the idea. It makes sense at a theoretical level that if someone else can reduce their emissions at a lower cost than you can, that it makes, that you should be able to pay for that to happen and get credit for it, and I'm okay with that. It's just not an area that has attracted a lot of my professional interest over the years, and I can understand how prone it is to fraud and corruption and greenwashing. The accounting systems and so on alone are Byzantine. So I've just sort of avoided it personally. But you know, if you can find out a way to minimize the cost of reducing emissions through some sort of a credit scheme, then more power to you. One of the interesting things about the systems that have been tried, and maybe my information is out of date, is they set them up and you need to have some way to get the market started. And then it turns out that the supply of credits is larger than what anybody needs, because the emissions are coming down so fast for other reasons. And we saw this with acid rain too. Acid rain, cap and trade, and there was all the coal burning companies were gnashing their teeth, and it was the end of the world, that there was going to be a cap, and they were going to have to spend all of this money on very expensive scrubbers. And it turned out that the problem sort of went away just by virtue of implementing the system. It wasn't that expensive to get off coal, or at least to get off the sulfurous coal. So I kind of liked Ontario's approach. It was short-lived. Sort of the cap and trade approach as opposed to the open emission trading market. But again, now we're in an emergency. And some of these ideas that were conceptualized in the late 1980s, which is when I first got involved in this issue, they seem a little bit too slow now to me. The things that you might have done to protect your house from burning down in 1988 are not necessarily at the top of your list when the fire has already started. So I'm not sure that our thinking about responses to climate change has kept up with climate change itself. We are now in the full-blown emergency response stage of this crisis, or at least we should be.
Okay, I see a hand up in the back, and yeah, please, thanks. I'll keep an eye out to know which direction I go in.
Can y'all hear me? Yes, you can. Okay.
Can I ask you to, I'm sorry I forgot to do this before, could I just ask you to very briefly introduce yourself?
Yes, my name is Gordon. Thanks so much, everyone. I just wanted to ask a little bit about this sort of like discursive shift that we're cluing in on that's like right in the title, right? The after denialism that suggests that there was something before outright denialism that's sort of passé now, and then now we're in this new phase of corporations sort of capturing that narrative. And my question is like, mostly for Mellissa, but other people too, like how strategically explicit is this like in the public relations space? Like, is there a smoke-filled room somewhere where there's a bunch of people that are like, oh, we were doubt mongers, but now we're gonna do something different? Or is it sort of more amorphous than that? Thanks.
Sure. I mean, yes, is the short answer to your question. The slightly more expanded answer is companies and their handlers, so to speak, are very sensitive to public opinion. They are, entirely predicated. All of the messaging, even the long-term strategy, is very sensitive to what people think. And we are now in a time where I think outright denial has become pretty marginalized. It's just not really palatable anymore for someone to come out and say, but we don't know if the science is right. So the kinds of strategies we see now, I don't know about the smoke-filled room. There's probably a lot more technologically advanced than that. But I do think that there's a great awareness of that fact and an effort to find a narrative that is more palatable, that will help people get more on board with what companies are doing, like carbon credits is one good example, but that is still a slow burn approach to dealing with climate action. So yeah, I do think the after denialism is a good moment to start from when we're thinking about this, because yeah, I think you're just going to find less and less. Sure, you'll find a few people on the margins who are still there. Some of whom have very many YouTube followers on their channels, but I think for the most part, we're past that, and I think it's what's much more insidious is this kind of we're all on board, we're all at the table argument, because it does mean for those of us who just can't bring ourselves to pay as much attention as would be needed, it does make us think that things are going in the right direction.
If I can hop in, because I agree that this new kind of insidious denial that we're seeing, the way I like to characterize it is, if the denial of the past was, climate change isn't real, it's like a hoax or whatever, yeah, we don't see that much anymore. Maybe here and there, but not a ton. The denial that is very common, right, is yes, it's real, but we're kind of denying what we all know we need to do about it. So like the fossil fuel question, there's still a lot of well, you know, Canadian oil is somehow more ethical, and so like that's a reason to keep it going, or just kind of casting doubt on the ability to do the transition. And of course, this is a sleight of hand, right? Because at the same time, the rhetoric is, this is difficult, this isn't going to happen overnight, as if anyone is talking about it being overnight. There's kind of this rhetoric that, you know, acknowledges that this is a problem, but all the material action, all the investment is still going towards the fossil fuel economy. I shouldn't say all. I mean, like that's kind of a generalization. But when we're talking about fossil fuel companies, for instance, you know, they can, like the Pathways Alliance members can all commit to net zero by 2050. But then when you look at their production plans, I mean, it's still expanding oil and gas. Now, maybe one last thing I'll say about Pathways is that the Pathways Alliance represents a bit of a rhetorical shift in the oil and gas industry. Previously, CAP, the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers, that was kind of the main lobby group. And you know, CAP is still influential in a way, but as some people in this room could probably tell me better, you know, CAP got caught with its hand in the cookie jar, to put it one way. They were caught meeting with the federal conservatives, Andrew Scheer at the time, to figure out how can we help your election. And so then, you know, Trudeau gets reelected. And all of a sudden, it's pretty hard to then go lobby the federal Liberals for your serious climate credentials when you've actually been working overtime to try to defeat that government. So the Pathways Alliance is kind of a split that happens, where it's the oil sands majors saying, yeah, we're committed to net zero, trust us, even though their actions don't uphold it. And you can actually see this in the lobbying records too, where you know, CAP's lobbying starts to go down at the same time Pathways Alliance starts to ramp up. There was kind of a real, probably smart on behalf of the industry's decision to do that. And it's, I would say, really slowed a lot of climate progress in this country.
Okay, I saw a hand up over here. Thank you. And then I'll come here. Thank you.
Is this working? Yes, okay. Hi everyone, my name is Mellissa, and I had a question for you all on what are your thoughts on corporations or financial institutions that are contributing to climate change, but are also donating to good causes like biodiversity conservation and restoration. The example that comes to mind is TD. I'm no investment expert, but I know through their portfolios they help people invest in fossil fuel companies, but they also fund much needed conservation work. So how can we still keep them accountable when they're, you know, as very small part of their work is doing good things, and maybe that is amplified? Thanks.
I'd like to take this one.
Well, I mean, what we do is we try to quantify the loan book of the banks. We have a whole section of our work that focuses on financial institutions and banks. And the Canadian banks routinely score very poorly against the also very poor performance of banks generally. So that's what we're doing. I mean, I don't know how much difference it's making, frankly. The oil and gas industry in this country is very powerful. It's different from most of our OECD partners in that regard. Maybe not so much from the US or maybe Norway, but it's a huge contribution to our balance of payments. 70% of the oil that we produce in this country is exported, mostly to the United States. 50% of the natural gas. So it's in Canada, but in some ways it's not of Canada. The demand that's driving that is in the US mostly, out of reach of any policies on the demand side that we might have. So it's a very difficult political and problem that goes to, you know, the entrenched economic interests in this country, and all of the banks in Canada are up to their eyeballs and always have been in it. again, I don't know what to say except when I meet communities that are, you look at what the Ottawa Energy Co-op is doing. It's, they're raising tens of millions of dollars up there now locally from people who are taking their money out of the traditional pensions and banks and putting it into a locally organized co-op for purposes of implementing housing retrofits and rooftop solar systems. And that type of grassroots taking back control of the capital example is happening all over the place on different scales, mostly small scales, but can add up over time. So that's something to consider. There's a good co-op here in Toronto. I don't know if there's anybody from the Toronto Solar Co-op. That's not their actual name. I forget it right now, but yeah.
I'm part of a global group of researchers called the Climate Social Science Network, and a bunch of us created a greenwashing assessment tool that has a series of indicators that anyone can use. It's for the public to use. It's open access. And you can just sort of go through these indicators and say, is there a presence of greenwashing? And one of the indicators is exactly what you described. Is there a contradiction? Is there a kind of political paradox where chances are the company's contribution to conservation is for political purposes or for social license type of purposes? They want to look good, but at the same time they're working to expand fossil fuels. It's greenwashing. I won't speak for that company specifically because I don't know what they're up to, but I think you have to take a really hard look at what is the long-term effect of both of those kinds of investment, the investment in conservation and the investment in fossil fuel expansion. And I think you have your answer.
You've had your hand up for a while. Thank you for being patient, and then I'll come over here. Thanks. Yeah, right here.
Thank you. My name is Keith. First, I want to thank Professor Aronczyk for your work. I work at Greenpeace, and the piece that you published on pathways, we added to our submission to the Competition Bureau on challenging pathways net zero claims.
Thank you so much.
But to build on sort of the question back here on the denialism is, I'm wondering if you sort of, in your research, you've come across the phenomenon, which I think a bunch of us in the environmental movement, we were very comfortable fighting climate denial because it's an argument about basic science, and it was like facts and arguments. And I kind of feel like the same PR companies, did the climate denial stuff and did it for tobacco and did it for oil, and they've been doing it since the 20s or so, whatever. But I feel that within the environmental movement, because we were kind of like used to and comfortable fighting denial, we really weren't ready for the discourse of delay that's now being operationalized. And it's a much slipperier thing to fight, right? Because it's like, we're all in this together, we're doing stuff, and I'm wondering if in your research, if you sort of would have advice to activists as to like how to actually more effectively fight that, because I feel like some of the stuff we still do, which is about, no, we just need to get the facts out there, is actually not working.
Okay, thank you so much for this question. I have a few things to say about it. One is just, I try to be a little careful about giving advice just because I try as a researcher to really stay with the evidence that I have as opposed to kind of advocacy, just keeping that line. But I also have a rant about this that I could get into, which has to do with precisely what you're talking about. How is it that we have let the conversation be dominated by companies? Because I really believe strongly that we have. What has happened? Why is it that the environmental movement has the facts, has the moral high ground, so to speak, has the weight of science behind it? And something tells me it has a little bit to do with, as you said, the lack of, people didn't see it coming. So there was a little bit of that in trying to kind of get their feet on the ground. But I think it's also that part of the moral compass that I think a lot of people who are really invested in the environmental movement have is that there is a right and wrong. There is an ethical sense of what needs to happen. And I think we've all been sort of harping on that tonight are really beating the drum on that. But the problem is this right and wrong universe, and we see it right now with the media system that we have. Trying to argue on a social media platform that you're right and other people are wrong is not a very effective strategy, and in fact, often works directly against you. There's that kind of boomerang effect. So sometimes I think what has happened is that people who are convinced they're right just continue to articulate that they're right, and they continue to sit on the facts. Not to say that we should necessarily take up the tactics of those who just say whatever it is they feel they need to say to get the message across. I don't think anyone would feel good about doing that. But on the other hand, we spoke earlier about hope. I'm a firm believer in hope. I'm actually an optimist. And I'm asking myself, why don't we have a narrative of hope and optimism that just goes above some of this, fact-based, right-wrong argument about what should happen and what isn't happening and who's to blame? At the same time, we can continue doing that work. The work of holding people accountable, I think, still needs to happen. But I think there is a way to regain the narrative, to regain that conversation. I personally I always look back. I'm no historian, but I'm very compelled by historical patterns, not just the tobacco industry, but back in the 1960s and 70s with the environmental movement, with the public interest research groups from that era, and the way in which they were the ones calling the shots at that time, and what precisely they were doing to call the shots in the 1960s and 70s. In fact, now I'm going to really go off, but I'll try to keep it to myself. I'll try to keep it relatively bounded. It was really in the 1980s when corporations recognized how successful the environmental movement had been in getting legislation and formation of the Environmental Protection Agency, in the kind of general public groundswell of support for environmental movements. It was in the 1980s that companies co-opted all of the tactics that public interest lawyers and public interest research groups had been using and used them to their own advantage. So it's actually not so much a story of just 1990s forward, companies dominating the narrative. It's a story of companies co-opting what was actually a narrative of hope and optimism and drive that the environmental movement started. So I'm hoping for some kind of cyclical return. I'm hoping for that return. And I think increasingly, Ralph mentioned the hurricanes and the storms, and more and more people are so directly affected by what's happening, and they're feeling it financially. And they're feeling it in their lives, their livelihoods. I think these are the people that are open to hearing a story of hope and optimism and long-term change, and getting on board with that. But yeah, we have to talk about what that narrative looks like.
Okay, down here, and then I'll move back over this way. Thank you.
Thank you. My name's Charlie. So I'd like to try and ask a question that follows up on this discussion of the contest that's underway when it comes to greenwashing. Who's winning, which narrative's winning, and which is not? Is it possible that we want to be greenwashed? And we had an earlier comment that it wasn't the expression eco-anxiety, eco-fear, but because of eco-anxiety and eco-fear, eco-grief, it may be too hard for large numbers of people to let in actions they can take, let in the truth of science, let in the facts of the storms. So I'm starting to feel that one of the insights of those promoting the greenwashing is that we have psychological and social needs to be greenwashed. And so my question is, if that's true, or in as much as it's true, what are the ways to remove some of the obstacles that permit a public consciousness that accepts greenwashing to act, to govern our political environment? Because the fossil fuel industry's dragging the puck, their delay needs many, many millions of people who want to be greenwashed.
Good question, Charlie. I like it. Who's ready?
You know, I think you probably have a better answer to your question than I do. I just have that feeling. But I certainly resonate with the perspective. You know, the fact that a lot of these companies are greenwashing, there's a positive dimension hidden there, which is they've come to the conclusion that their customers want to hear this message. And now the fact that they may be deceptive in what they're delivering, and I think deception is part of the definition of greenwashing, has to be exposed. But they've come to the same conclusion you do. People want to hear this, so let's give it to them. How we get beyond that kind of dysfunctional standoff, I mean, for me, what we're just trying to do is show the concrete, positive possibilities that exist beyond the fossil fuel age. And just in my career, we've come a long way in that regard. I think most people, perhaps most people in this room, when they really stop to think about it, don't believe that we can get off fossil fuels. And if you don't believe that it's possible, I think your brain will go into overdrive, not only to welcome greenwashing, but to try and grab anything that will sort of help you believe that maybe we don't have to get off. Because nobody wants to believe simultaneously that we must get off fossil fuels, but that it's not possible. And so a lot of the tension and the conflict that we see in the conversations around climate change come from sort of the cognitive dissonance between those two poles. We've got to get off fossil fuels. We can't get off fossil fuels. It's an unresolvable pair of facts, and the human brain will do cartwheels to try and find a way to stay sane and happy in the face of those incompatible realizations. So I don't know if I'm connecting with the point that you're raising, but that's the response that it triggered in my mind, is that it just is so important that we develop a concrete, positive image, many concrete, positive images of what this future could look like. And it actually, when you start doing that, it turns out it's better than the alternative. You know, we talk about the storms and the floods and the fires. That's going to happen. We don't need to conjure that up. And that's the evidence that the status quo is actually the problem. And I think that people, therefore, are open to exploring, well, what is the alternative to the status quo? Surely there must be one. And so my personal answer to your question is I try to work on revealing what those possibilities might be in the hope that that will contribute to the courage and the leadership that we need to realize those futures. This is a big change. And we've been through this before. We used to think that the sun revolved around the earth not that long ago. And we changed our understanding of where we are in the scheme of things. And then we changed it again when we saw that picture of the whole earth taken from space. And now it's changing again as we begin to understand that we are not here with nature, we are here embedded in nature. So this is a long, long story that involves chapters of humans continuing to evolve their understanding of where they are in the scheme of things. And the more that we can articulate what that looks like, what that could be physically look like, what it means to our technologies and our communities, then the better chance that we have that the environmental crisis will end up being a gift, in the sense that it will be what finally leads us to make peace not only with each other, but with nature. And greenwashing will be somewhere far in the rearview mirror at that point.
Did you want to add something?
I was just going to add, I want to reframe a little bit what you said, because I'm not sure that we want to be greenwashed. But I do think that as a culture, we are a consumer culture. And I think that one of the narratives we do really want to hold on to is that we can consume our way out of the problem. And I think that's just because that's how we form our identities. We're so caught up in the sense that we consume to be who we are. And again, companies have been very, very good at capitalizing on that idea. And I think I can think of no better example than recycling. The idea that companies should not have to change the materials of their production, but rather that we as consumers should just recycle. There's been some fantastic studies that have come out lately demonstrating what a farce so much plastic recycling has been. But I also want to move us away a little bit from just psychological issues, which I think are really centered on the individual, and more about cultural and societal issues, because I really do think it's broader than just what we ourselves think. And what that means is that the solution is also broader than what we ourselves do. So, these suggestions about cooperatives and about group and collective efforts, I think are really important. There's a great book, I'm an academic, I have to recommend a book, by the sociologist Carrie Norgard about the denial, the cultural denial of a community. And she goes and spends time in this community and just demonstrates how the stories we tell ourselves are really the way that we come to understand what needs to be done. I'm a big believer in the possibilities of trying to think culturally and societally about what needs to happen, and not just feeling like we ourselves are bad and wrong and all that, because I just think that can be really very demeaning for ourselves, and we have enough things to worry about as it is.
We have time for, a few more questions, and I see a number of hands up around the room. So what I'm going to do is actually move quickly through those questions and then bring them as a collective to the panel. I hope that's okay with everyone here. Okay, so both of you had your hands up right here, so I'll start in the center. Thank you.
Where are the large accounting firms speaking up against the fake carbon credits? It's not a particularly mature market, but it's mature enough for them to say this 40% is complete garbage, and they're just getting to it. And a similar question is, why is nobody speaking more strongly against the unaudited results of the carbon capture and sequestration that's now been active in Canada for 10 years?
Okay, I'm going to ask you to hold for a moment. I'm going to go right here and then over here. Yep.
You were talking about kind of moving away from a human, maybe centered approach to this question. I'm kind of had this large question about like, where does AI and technology fit into this whole story? There's AI being developed for financialization, right? That's supposed to guide what investment looks like, particularly onto kind of like negative futures. There's AI that's totally changing materials research and design, right? The Acceleration Consortium here at U of T is finding ways to produce 1,000 new synthetic substances every day. And I find that AI will totally change what we might be able to even possibly imagine our future energy infrastructures will look like, because the human mind won't really be at the center of any of them. So I'd love to hear a bit of your thoughts on that.
I'm going to help with the moving around the room. Here we go. Coming to the back.
Thanks. I have a question about banks, and not, we discussed earlier about banks kind of investing in oil and gas, but my question is somewhat different. My question is more about, in your work, whether you've heard about ways that banks are making progress in incorporating climate modeling into their business decision making. So banks, at the end of the day, are a business of risk, and they are the backbone of our economy. And so they can't make decisions that are too risky for the money that they are holding for all of us, right? So I'm wondering why Canadian banks have been so slow at trying to understand climate risks to the assets that they're managing, and how this kind of work can progress. So for example, a few years ago, I've heard there's one single climate team for the entire Royal Bank of Canada, and there's maybe one or two staff members who had a mandate on climate. But as we know, there's so much property at risk when we are talking about climate change. A lot of financial assets across the country. So yeah, I want to hear about your thoughts on kind of progress in this space and how we can push banks to do more.
So the one thing that I've seen that challenges capitalism, business as usual, is a health and safety movement that the labor unions built in the 1970s when my fellow tradespeople were going to the tar sands, as we used to call it in the day. We also were fighting the system that had us dying on a regular basis, whether of disease or on the workplaces. And that was about regulation. No incentive. No employer ever changed their practice for incentive. It was about regulation and empowering workers in the workplace to demand that those regulations be upheld. One of the tactics that I've heard people suggest, if we're dealing with all of the denialism and all the reality that people are having a hard time putting a roof over their head, let alone thinking of paying more for something, is a simple demand that the government end all subsidies to the fossil fuel industry. It seems like a simple one to me, but somehow it ain't there. And from whether it's from a communication strategy or understanding the amount of money that's actually involved, I'd really be interested in your comments.
Thank you. I'm going to pass the floor back to the panelists because that's a lot to hold on to already.
Okay, there's a lot of interesting stuff here. I think most of my comments are going to focus on the question of the banks. Okay, let's think about this. So you're entirely right. Canadian banks are deeply entrenched in fossil fuels. They're all among the world's top financiers of fossil fuels. I think there's a couple important things here. You're right that they're failing to properly account for this risk. It's just kind of undeniable, I think. And you're absolutely right. I love hearing this, that that there's so many assets at risk here. It's no exaggeration that there's no safe investment in a 3-degree warming world. It's just all going to be bad. So, why the banks have, really failed to take this into consideration, I think comes from a few different reasons. One is that Canada's major banks, they're all major shareholders of each other. They're all major shareholders of the big oil and gas companies. And at the same time that, there's that very clear kind of like financial reason why they're keen on this, the fossil fuel bubble is also just growing as European banks pull out, as foreign firms pull out of the oil sands. It is like becoming a very concentrated, risky sector for Canadian banks. So why don't they get out of this? Part of it is banks very narrowly interpret their fiduciary duty, I think. So a lot of people probably think about the fiduciary duty as the legal obligation that a company would have. It's usually commonly interpreted as, make money for your shareholder. But that's not what Canadian courts have upheld. An Ontario court, I believe it was, found that in the wake of the subprime mortgage crisis, CIBC was holding a tremendous amount of these really kind of junk investments. And they were scolded by the court and said, you should have been testing against this. You should, even a 1 in 100 year tsunami can be predicted. You should be predicting it. There's some regulation that could maybe do this. You could you could prevent fossil fuel linked directors from sitting on a bank's board. You could put climate expertise on the board, require that in some way to try to shift that. But we also might need a bank to really get hit hard by a court case that just really clarifies what their fiduciary duty is, that they do have a legal obligation to respond on climate change. And one last thing about it, because otherwise I'll just kind of keep rambling here. But, you know, part of the problem too is that it's not just that fossil fuel companies are currently making a lot of money. That's why they're interesting investments for banks. That's certainly part of it. I mean, banks are out there to try to make money. But in Canada, we've also just delegated money creation to the private banks. So, like, what we mean here is if you know, and there's like Library of Canada, like research papers detailing all this that, you know, happy to share. But the way it works is it's not like the bank just has all of our money and then if you want a loan for your mortgage, they go into the vault and get the money and then you have it. They're just going into your account and adding some zeros, right? It's the same thing when a fossil fuel company is going, when they need hundreds of millions of dollars or billions of dollars for a major expansion. It's just the banks deciding we think we could get paid back on this in 5 or 10 years or whatever the case may be. It's just a money printing license that we've given them. And we haven't put the Bank of Canada or any of our federal regulators to work to actually try to restore what I would say is a bit of sanity in this. So, you know, a few things, just briefly, the Bank of Canada could charge higher interest rates on banks with fossil fuel, you know, if they're exposed to fossil fuels above a certain threshold. We could say that is a risky investment. We're going to charge higher interest rates on you to try to tip that. You could change collateral framework, so you can't use fossil fuel assets as part of your collateral on interbank lending markets. You could just kind of keep going with this. I mean, on the extreme, you could say, we're not going to bail you out the next time there's a crisis. Now, that's maybe one of the more radical things, because that would have implications for all of us. Probably politically impossible to see that happen anyway. But you know, just to say, there are lots of tools here that we could be using that we're not using to try to align the banks. And I think like the evidence is clear that they're not going to do it on their own. They need to be regulated and pushed into it.
Mellissa, you want to jump in?
Okay, I'm going to address the AI question and the question about why, you know, the simple question of why the government isn't just ending subsidies to fossil fuels. So the AI question, I mean, on the one hand, you're right. There is no, we're in a brave new world when it comes to AI, and tomorrow we, you know, may have come up with some solution that was not even imaginable, you know, a few months ago. On the other hand, who owns the AI platforms? It's mostly the private sector. It's mostly corporate leaders. So I worry that the kinds of solutions that will be imagined by the sector are solutions to problems that the corporate sector wants to think about, not necessarily the problems we need to be thinking about. So that's one. And the corollary to that is, you know, AI 1.0, like big data, where what we mostly saw in the era of big data was the private sector trying to use big data for climate solutions, but again, using it for climate solutions that were business-minded, that were business-friendly or that brought about profit. You know, just one quick example would be like Waze, the GPS system for driving that I use constantly, arguing that you could use, rather justifying their continued capture of people's private data, their private information, to judge where there would be, if there was going to be a flood, how to redirect people around the flood. So yes, that's a valuable thing to do. Does it justify the continued uptake and surveillance of private data? That's a much more debatable question. And how is that, how is Waze then using that knowledge to continue to be profitable in what they're doing? And I'm going to guess that we're going to see the same kind of debates taking place in the AI sphere. So that's just, you know, that's a very small sliver, but it's part of a much longer conversation. And I mean, to your question, which of course is the, you know, in a way the simplest, but the most obvious, which is why don't we just say the government and private industry or fossil fuel industry are going to, you know, sever, is, at least from everything I've seen in my research over the years, business and politics are so closely intertwined that to suggest that the government could just cut it off would be to imagine that we would actually completely transform government, because that's what would have to happen. We would have to change the ways that governments get elected. We would have to change the relationships that governments have with business. And here, again, I admit I'm thinking a little bit more of the American case because I know it a little bit better. There's probably a better set of regulations in Canada about that. But if I look at American government agencies and who's been in the White House and the administrative agencies there has been such a close relationship with business elites that I mean, it's almost impossible to separate the two. And I think that that's one reason we don't see it. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, no, I understand. I mean, I would love to see it. I agree with you that that is a path that would make an enormous difference.
Ralph, did you want to jump in at all?
Yeah, a bit of a downer addition to that. Last time I looked at the numbers, the federal and provincial income that came from the fossil fuel industry was a multiple of the subsidy that went back. I mean, I would support stopping the subsidy. I don't know how much difference it would make, but there's, what is it, $4 or $5 billion, depending on how you count it. It's like about $30 to $40 billion if you add up the income taxes of the employees, the gasoline tax, the corporate tax, the royalties from the oil and gas leases that some governments collect. It's a pretty big number, and it's much bigger than the subsidy that goes the other way. I didn't want to, and I didn't go looking for that finding. I was doing an analysis of the financial flows of energy in Canada, and I realized, oh my gosh, governments are quite dependent on this industry for income. So that's the other side of the subsidy coin. In terms of that last set of questions, I wouldn't have anything to add to what's been said. The one that didn't get addressed was the first one around there were two questions. One related to whether the large accounting firms are duplicitous, I think was the implication in your question when it came to the ineffectiveness of carbon credit systems. And I think your question was why are they not speaking out on it? Was that
Well, what's taken them so long?
Oh, but why would they speak out on it?
Well, they're an accounting firm. They're supposed to be saying that this actually does meet the numbers.
Right. You're talking about the auditing of the carbon accounting systems.
Yes.
Yeah. That's like I can't, as I said earlier, I haven't kept up to date. Some of those systems seem pretty tight to me. Some of the companies that do the accounting on those transactions seem to have integrity. I don't know about the big accounting firms. And your second question had to do with carbon capture and storage, which just strikes me as a huge black hole for public money that has no chance of helping us get out of the mess we're in. And the sooner that we stop supporting that, the better off. But I think it's just one more way that the government finds to support the oil and gas industry. Because a lot of their interest in that technology is actually it's a great way to produce more oil and gas. You push the CO2 back down into the ground and it pushes up more gas or more oil. And that's historically what most of it has been and continues to be used for. Most of the carbon capture efforts underway in the world actually go into increasing oil production. So it's just crazy.
Okay, I know our time is up for this evening, but I want to say thank you to all of you for the very thoughtful questions and the very thoughtful dialogue carried out here, and the fact that there were more hands that we couldn't get to suggests that the conversation will continue, which is really the best evidence of a great conversation. So it's been a really rewarding evening on that front. I want to just extend a few thanks before we say goodnight. First of all, to Director Imre Zeman, who organized us, and his wonderful team. Imre is the director of the Institute behind all of the events that you're hearing about. And on their behalf, I would also like to say thank you to generous sponsors for their contributions, particularly to speaker gift bags from the neighborhood, which are coming from local vendors and companies committed to sustainability and reducing plastic waste, including the Neighborhood Coffee, Arcturix, Propeller Coffee, Yves Rocher, The Pen Shop, and U Theory. And finally, please join me in thanking our panelists this evening for a really stimulating conversation. Thanks, everybody, and please keep an eye on the website for the next events to come from the Institute.